Good morning, everybody. I hope you're all having a good Thursday so far. Unfortunately, I'm not able to be there with you in person today because I have an event that I have to go to that I wasn't able to get out of. So I am pre-recording this lecture. So before we get started, I just want to go ahead and say that I do want each of you, if you have the book, to maybe kind of go through this chapter and review a little bit, just some of your basic biology stuff, because compared to what we have been doing, this lecture is going to be a little bit more detailed and a lot more kind of into the science of things and a lot more information, more challenging material. So I really advise you to read the chapter in the book, and then also if you don't have the book, just kind of read through the lecture, after today, read through it maybe today, tomorrow, because what we're going to be doing in the chapters after this will build off of this material. So make sure that you pay close attention today, and then also maybe review some of this material on your own to make sure that you fully understand it and have a good grasp on it before we move on. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So today we're going to start section 3. So we're going to be talking about the biology of domestic animals. And so mainly what we're going to cover today is going to be anatomy and physiology of domestic animals. So anatomy pretty much means the structure of things, and then physiology is their function. How do they work and what do they do? So to take you back to biology, for those of you that have had it kind of recently, hopefully some of this will be a review. Some of you may not have had it in a while, so this might kind of be bringing some things back. And if you haven't really had a lot of biology, some of this stuff may be new. So I just want to kind of start with the basics, and then we'll work our way up there from there. So just to kind of review, the organs of the body are made up of different cells. And just like the body is made up of different organs, every cell has different organelles. So that's the term for the different parts of the cell. So cells contain a nucleus, a cell membrane, mitochondria, ribosomes, and endoplasmic reticulum, or ER is what you'll probably hear me refer to it as, Golgi apparatus, lysosomes, and then cytoplasm. So we're going to talk about a little bit about what each of these do in a second. So just before we jump into that, just to kind of show you what a cell looks like, an animal cell. So where are all of these things in the cell and how do they relate to each other? So as you can see on this picture, the big circle in the middle that's kind of a purplish pink color is the nucleus. And then attached to the nucleus, you have the endoplasmic reticulum, and you have a rough endoplasmic reticulum and a smooth endoplasmic reticulum. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later. Then you have the ribosomes that are kind of, some are attached to the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and then some are out in the cytoplasm. This big green kind of maze-looking thing is the Golgi apparatus. So we'll talk about what that does. And then the little orange ovalish-looking things are called the mitochondrion, or mitochondria. Mitochondrion is singular. And then the pink circles are the lysosomes. So surrounding all of this, you have the plasma membrane, and then there are a couple of other things on here that we're not really going to talk about that are a little bit more specific than we really need to go for the point of this class. So before we get started, so cells are important because they make up all the organs in your body. And so in order to carry out their function, cells have to produce proteins. They have to be able to respond to different changes in the body's environment and things like that. And so how do they do this? So the central dogma, or what dogma is kind of just a principle or a fact that has been accepted to be true in that field, and that's just how things work. That's the order of it. Everyone knows, and it's a tried and true fact. So the central dogma of molecular biology is that DNA is converted to RNA, which is then converted to protein. So in all the cells, there's DNA that's encoded for, different encodes different proteins and things like that. And so if a cell needs to respond to a changing environment in the body or produce any sort of protein, the DNA has to be converted to RNA. And DNA is converted to RNA through a process called transcription. And then RNA is then converted to protein through a process called translation. And so the way that I kind of try to keep this straight in my head is, if you think about it, if you're transcribing something, you're basically just kind of copying down what someone is saying, or, like maybe in court where they have a transcriber writing down, what the person is saying. But you're keeping it the same. It's pretty much similar. You're not changing it a whole lot. You're just kind of, rewriting it in a different way. And so that's kind of how DNA goes to RNA. They're very, very similar. There's only a little minor difference between the two. So that's just called transcription. And then the way that I keep RNA to protein straight is that if you're translating something, like if you're going from another language, like from, let's say, English to Spanish, that's really, really changing what you're saying. So you're really changing what's happening. So translation, as you can see on this picture, RNA and DNA look similar, but RNA and protein don't really resemble each other. So that RNA is being translated into something different. So that's just kind of how I keep that straight. And then you see this red arrow here. When you're going back from RNA to DNA, that's just called reverse transcription, because you're just doing the reverse. However, you can't go from protein back to RNA, because obviously you can see protein is in a much different form, and so you can't go back to the RNA from the protein. So the proteins will be made, they'll be sent out into the body or into the cell, and they will do their function, and then once they're no longer needed, those proteins will be degraded. So there's no going back to RNA. So to talk about the parts of the cell and kind of what their role is in that central dogma of converting DNA all the way out to protein. So we have the nucleus, and nuclei would be the plural form. And the nucleus contains our chromosomes, and so therefore they contain most of the cell DNA. And this is most because we've talked about it a little bit in a previous lecture, that there's one other organelle that does contain some DNA. And I don't know if any of you remember, it was a question on your first exam, but the mitochondria do contain some of their own DNA. But so most of the DNA is going to be in the nucleus. So like I said, when a protein is needed, that DNA has to go to RNA first. And so if the DNA has to go to RNA and the DNA is in the nucleus, it makes sense that the nucleus is the site of transcription. So that is where RNA is produced from the DNA template. So surrounding the entire cell is the cell membrane. And so the cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. And so just to kind of, before we talk about what it does exactly, explain a little bit about the structure. So this picture at the bottom, you can see these are phospholipids. And so they divide the extracellular space from the intracellular space. So they kind of keep things from, keep things inside the cell, keep things outside of the cell that don't need to come in. And this phospholipid bilayer has different transporters for ions and nutrients. So depending on that function of the cell, the membrane will have transporters to let certain things in or out. And then some things can kind of passively diffuse, like water, but we won't get too much into that. And then it also contains receptors for hormones. So we'll talk about hormones a little bit later in this chapter. But so hormones are produced when something is going on in the body, and then all the cells need to respond a certain way. Well, how do the hormones communicate with the cells of an organ, right? So they have to have a receptor so that those hormones can actually bind to the receptor on that cell in the plasma membrane, and then that will tell the cell what it needs to do and how it needs to respond. So the phospholipid bilayer, like I said, it keeps the intracellular space and the extracellular space separated. So it allows for different ionic environments inside and outside. And it also allows for an electrical potential difference across the cell membrane. So basically, electrical potential difference just means, for example, if you have sodium and chloride, sodium has a positive charge, chloride has a negative charge. So in order for things to move in and out of the cell, that electrical potential difference has to be maintained, because if everything is equally balanced on both sides, it's a little bit harder to move things in and out. So you kind of need an electrical potential there to be able to do that. So being able to keep those spaces separated allows for that electrical potential difference across the membrane so that things can be moved inside and outside. So the electrical potential difference is critical for nerve conduction, muscle contraction, and hormone release, just a couple. It's critical for a lot of other things. Pretty much anything that needs to be going in and out of the cell, that electrical potential difference is very important. So here you see different phospholipids, and then you see that these red circles are the heads of the phospholipid, and they are called hydrophilic. So that means that they actually are water-loving. So that's kind of what that term means. So if you think of, hydro, water is H2O, so that's kind of how I keep it somewhat straight in my head and remember that term. So water loving means that they can touch kind of an aqueous or watery environment. So on the intracellular space, you'll have the cytoplasm, which we'll talk about in a little bit. That's kind of more of a aqueous kind of solution. And then on the extracellular space, you might have some, water liquids outside the cell as well. So those heads are going to be facing those directions because they really like water. However, the tails of the phospholipids are hydrophobic, so they do not like water. So they're actually going to point inwards away from the water because they don't want to be around it. And so an easy way to keep that straight is hydrophobic. If you have a phobia of something, you're scared of it, right? So hydrophobic just means that they don't want to be near water. So they point towards the inside. So that's kind of what gives this plasma membrane its shape. And that's really, really important for things getting in and out of the cell. So the next organelle that we're going to talk about that's extremely important is the mitochondria. So the singular form of that word would be mitochondrion. And the mitochondria are known as the powerhouse of the cell. And that is because they generate the energy for all the processes that the cell has to do. So they contain the electron transfer proteins, which are just proteins involved in the generation of ATP. And so they also have some metabolic enzymes and then that mitochondrial DNA. So like I said, the nucleus has most of the DNA, but it doesn't have all of it. So the mitochondria will have some of their own DNA as well. And then kind of a throwback to your first section and what was on your first exam. In most species, your mitochondrial DNA comes from your mother. So that's just something kind of interesting to note there. So mitochondria generate ATP. Well, what is ATP? Why is it important? So ATP is adenosine triphosphate. And so typically no one really says adenosine triphosphate. ATP is a commonly accepted acronym for that. So we'll just call it ATP for the purpose of this class. So ATP is the energy source of the cell. So in order for the cell to produce protein and do transcription and translation and take things in and out of the cell, ATP is needed. It needs energy, right? If you want to get up and walk across the room, you're going to have to use energy. Your cells are going to need energy to allow you to do that. So ATP is the main energy source of the cell, and it's produced in the mitochondria, and that's why the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So that's really the takeaway for that. So then we have the ribosomes and the endoplasmic reticulum, or the ER. So I'm going to call it the ER for probably the rest of this lecture and most of the class. So if I'm saying ER, that's what I mean, not emergency room. So the endoplasmic reticulum is actually where protein synthesis occurs. So remember we said in the nucleus, that's where the RNA is being produced from the DNA. So you're going from DNA to RNA with transcription. And then in the ER is where that RNA is then used to synthesize protein. So that's translation. So transcription is in the nucleus, and then that RNA goes out into the endoplasmic reticulum where it is converted into protein by translation. So Ribosomes are found free in the cytoplasm. You probably remember that picture early on of the cell where you had the little small dots of the ribosomes kind of out in the cytoplasm. And they're also found attached to the rough ER. So if you remember that picture, there's the rough ER and there's the smooth ER. And what makes the rough ER rough is that these ribosomes are attached. And so a good way to remember that is ribosomes starts with an R. If ribosomes are attached, then it's the rough, which also starts with an R, endoplasmic reticulum. So if there's no ribosomes, then it's the smooth. So the rough ER, just keep the R's in mind, ribosomes, rough, and you should be able to keep that straight. So the ribosomes are really, really important for synthesizing protein, and they help go from RNA to protein. And so obviously, if that is happening in the endoplasmic reticulum, you need to have ribosomes there. So that's how that process kind of happens. So if you remember back to the picture, we had that green kind of, it almost kind of looks like a maze type thing, called the Golgi apparatus. So what that does, and I've always kind of heard it called the post office of the cell, and that always helps me keep it straight with its function. So the Golgi apparatus is where proteins that are destined to be exported, so sent out of the cell and into the body, are packaged into secretory granules. So basically, if you think about a post office, they get all your mail and they sort that out and figure out where it needs to go. They might put it in a box, they might put it in an envelope, depending on what the situation is, and then they send it out into the world. So the post office analogy has always really made sense to me. So the Golgi apparatus modifies so it can change proteins if it needs to, and then sorts them as well as lipids, and then packages them to be sent out. So some may stay in the cell and they don't make it very far. Some may be taken to some transporters to the membrane to be sent out into the body. So the Golgi is really responsible for that. So just think of it like the post office. So lysosomes are the little pink circles that we saw on that picture. And so those are kind of known as the digestive system of the cell. So basically, lysosomes contain enzymes that will degrade proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, pretty much anything that needs to be degraded in the cell. The lysosomes are going to take care of that. So that's where the degradation of waste proteins occur. So remember I said you can't go back from protein to RNA. So when a protein is no longer needed, or if it's old, or if it was made incorrectly and it's not functioning properly, the lysosomes will degrade that protein. And they can also degrade material that is taken up by the cell. So if any foreign material gets through or anything like that, that the cell has taken up, the lysosomes can degrade that, and they can also degrade components of the cell itself if needed. So especially if, maybe parts of the cell, if something gets in and there's a bacteria or a virus or something, and that's kind of taking over parts of the cell, the lysosomes can actually digest parts of the cell. And, like I said, old proteins and things like that. So they are the digestive system of the cell. So then the cytoplasm is a pretty easy one. We've kind of mentioned it a little bit on some of the other slides. So the cytoplasm is basically just a thick solution that fills each cell. And so it contains the soluble elements within the cell. So it pretty much contains all of the material within a living cell, excluding the nucleus. So it's composed of cytosol and then the organelles. So the organelles are all the different parts that we've talked about. So like the ER, the mitochondria, the lysosomes, the Golgi, things like that. So that all resides in the cytoplasm outside the nucleus. So briefly, we're just going to talk a little bit about cell division. So cells need to divide for a number of reasons, mainly for growth and things like that. If you have a tissue and like a type of tissue in your body and it needs to start growing, then how are you going to do that? The cells need to start dividing. You need more cells. So the process of cell division is called mitosis. So that's a good term for you to be familiar with in any sort of biology class. Mitosis basically just means cell division in its basic definition. So if you want to get a little more specific, that cell division results in what are called two daughter cells, and those cells will have the same number and kind of chromosomes as the parent cell, so the cell that you started out with. So it's very important that the two new cells have the same number and kind of chromosomes as the parent cell, because if that process doesn't happen correctly, then you're going to have trouble. So they need to have exactly the same makeup as the original cell. And so that involves replication of the DNA. So the DNA will need to be replicated so that the cell can then divide and the two daughter cells can have matching DNA. So also, again, why is cell division important? Why does it need to happen? So all cells do what is called turning over. And so that basically just means that new cells will replace old cells that die. So something to kind of help think about this is if you get sunburn, for example, your skin might start to peel after a while, right? So those skin cells are old and they're dying and they're falling off. So if you didn't have production of new skin cells, we'd be really in big trouble, right? So you have to have some turnover there, and you have to have new cells constantly replacing the old cells. The same as in our digestive system. So we have cells that are, there, and what we eat and things like that, cells get old over time. And if you ended up having food poisoning or something, right, a pathogen, that could destroy some of the cells in your intestines. And you don't want to just, okay, well, I have a certain number of cells and then that's it, and they get destroyed, oh well. You need new cells to be produced to be able to replace damaged and old cells. So just some sort of practical applications there to think about why cell division is so important. And especially if you're going from a baby to, within a couple of years, your body's going to be growing and you're going to be getting bigger, and you need more cells to do that. So that's called cell turnover. And then the process of division is mitosis. So new cells are needed for turnover as well as during growth and development. So I think we've pretty much covered this slide and why that's important. So the cells make up the different organs in the body. And so we have what are called major organ systems. So different organs can kind of fall into a category of an organ system, and that's how they're divided up. So the main ones that we're going to talk about are the gastrointestinal tract, the cardiovascular system, respiratory organs, muscle, skeleton, adipose tissue, the nervous system and the brain, and endocrine organs. So we're going to talk a little bit more detail about each one of these. So the gastrointestinal tract they're all extremely important. This one's kind of near and dear to me because I'm a nutritionist, so I mostly work with the digestive system. So the gastrointestinal tract is basically a good way to think of it is that it's kind of just a long tube that extends through your body. So from your mouth to the other end, it's basically just kind of one long tube, essentially. And so the main functions of the gastrointestinal tract are feed and food digestion. So just a quick little terminology distinction here. So if something is being fed to animals, it is called feed. If it's for humans, it's food. So just a little bit of terminology that you may see here or there. So the proper term for each of those. So if you're talking about, a lot of people say pet food, well, pets are animals. So technically the real way to say that would be pet feed. So just a key distinction that we'll probably get into a little bit more in the next lesson, which will be on animal nutrition. So just to kind of give you a little tidbit there. So digestion is the chemical breakdown of complex molecules in the food or feed to simple compounds that can be easily absorbed. So we've kind of talked about this a little bit when we've talked about the different digestive systems of the animals and how the feed is kind of broken down. So that's really the main point of digestion. Because your, gastrointestinal cells can't take in like a huge bite of a sandwich or something like that. That has to be digested into something that the cells can absorb. So that's what happens in the gastrointestinal tract. So it's also responsible for absorption of nutrients as well as water and immunological protection against pathogenic organisms. So this is kind of a hard concept to think about, and it's something that took me a little while to really understand fully, but it's kind of true. Your digestive system is almost kind of still considered the outside of your body, because if you think about it, it's basically one long tube from end to end. And so anything that's going to get into your body would kind of come from your digestive system if you're eating it, right? Unless you have a cut or something like that. So it's very important that the gastrointestinal tract has immunological protection against pathogens. So if you eat something and it gets into your digestive system, you have to have things in place in that system to make sure that that pathogen isn't going to get into the rest of your body and cause problems. So that's a really important function of the gastrointestinal tract as well. Fermentation of feed to provide nutrients, which we've talked about several times before. So cows have that fermentation in the rumen, and then monogastrics have it in the cecum and maybe a little bit in the colon. And then you have your hind gut fermenters as well, which are your horses and rabbits and things like that. And then the GI tract is also responsible for movement of ingesta through the gut. And so ingesta is kind of just a term for whatever you've eaten, and then it's going to kind of be mixed with fluids as it goes along the process. So the gastrointestinal tract will make sure that that moves through the gut so that it can be properly digested. So a little bit more about digestion specifically. So like I said, it's the chemical breakdown of complex molecules in the feed to simple compounds that are easily absorbed. So how does digestion happen? How are these compounds broken down? So they are broken down by enzymes, and enzymes catalyze the breakdown of complex chemicals. That's kind of their definition. So some of the categories, which one of these at least one of these should look familiar to you. Amylases. We talked about amylase and how as humans kind of evolved and things like that, as they started eating more starch, there started being higher concentrations of amylase in their saliva, and the genome contains more started containing genes for this enzyme. So amylases are responsible for the breakdown of starch. So that would be, like breads and things like that. And then proteases are responsible for breaking down protein. So that's pretty easy. Pro and pro, they're kind of easy to keep straight. And then lipases break down lipids. So again, you have the LIP and the PRO, protein, proteases, lipids, lipases. So those are kind of easy to keep straight. Amylases is a little bit harder to remember because starch doesn't sound like amylases, but starch is made up of a sugar called amylose. And so that's where amylases comes from. So I know we've been over this several times before, but just to kind of give you a quick review on the structure of the GI tract, just a simple one. So this would be a monogastric GI tract. So for most of the things we'll talk about, we'll kind of lean on the side of monogastrics because there are more of them and they have a little bit of a simpler system. So just to refresh your memory, you have the esophagus that connects the mouth to the stomach. So food will come from the mouth down into the stomach through the esophagus. Then you have the small intestine, and then you have your cecum, and then the large intestine. So the colon is the cecum and the large intestine, basically. Or the large intestine is the colon, sometimes called the colon. So just as a quick review. So we'll talk a little bit about each of those in detail. So the mouth typically has teeth, except in birds. That's a big difference between poultry and the other livestock species. They don't have teeth. They have a beak. So feed is typically chewed and then mixed with saliva. And the enzyme amylase starts the digestion of starch. So remember, amylase is responsible for starch digestion, and salivary amylase is that specific kind of amylase. So salivary amylase would be in the saliva, and it starts digesting starch. So as soon as you eat like a piece of bread or anything with starch in it, it's already being somewhat digested in your mouth, just a little bit. So then you have the esophagus that links the mouth to the stomach. So that's pretty much its function. Then you have the stomach, which is the site of muscular mixing of ingesta. So the stomach will kind of contract a little bit and move, and it can kind of mix that ingesta together. with any kind of saliva or any enzymes in the saliva from the mouth. And then also the stomach will add gastric secretions. And so that the gastric secretions will contain hydrochloric acid, or you can just write it or know it as HCl, and then pepsinogen. And pepsinogen is important for protein digestion. So pepsinogen is actually an inactive form known as a zymogen, and then it's converted to pepsin. And pepsin actually is the active form which will start protein digestion. So that will happen in the stomach. So obviously if the stomach is producing acid, the pH of the stomach is going to be pretty low. So that really is important for enzyme function and for starting protein digestion. So just as a quick reminder, ruminants have 4 compartments, which we talked about: rumen, reticulum, omasum, abomasum. Everyone should be pretty good on those after your second test. And then just another quick modification that we talked about is that the avian stomach has 2 parts. So they have the gizzard, which is where that muscular kind of mixing and muscular digestion happens, mechanical digestion, and then the proventriculus. And the proventriculus in the bird is kind of like their true stomach. That's where the chemical digestion is going to happen. That's where the acid and everything is going to be produced in the bird. So just a few little modifications there as a reminder. So moving on to the small intestine. So the small intestine is the site of carbohydrate, protein, and fat digestion. And those are digested by enzymes like we already talked about. And then the products of that digestion are absorbed in the small intestine. So the small intestine is actually divided into 3 separate sections. So these sections are called the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And the way that I was taught to remember this when I took intro was don't jump in. And so the D obviously stands for duodenum, J is for jejunum, and the I is for the ileum. So on an exam or something like that, that's always how I would keep it straight. And even to this day, I still think don't jump in. And that helps me remember the parts of the small intestine. So next, after the small intestine, we have the colon. So the colon includes the large intestine, the cecum, or in birds, they have 2, so ceca, and the rectum. So that's all considered the colon. So the colon is where fermentation of the ingesta by microorganisms happens. So just like the rumen in the cow. And then absorption of water also happens in the colon, and as well as minerals and other nutrients. And so it's kind of cool because if you ever dissect an animal and you can see some of the ingesta from their small intestine and then from the colon it's a lot more solidified than it is in the small intestine, because in the colon all of that liquid and that water has been absorbed out. So it's more solid, like what you would typically see or think feces looks like. So that's kind of a good way to keep it straight in your mind also. So this slide's just a quick review slide. I feel like everyone should be pretty good on this by now. I feel like I've really drilled a lot of this home. So, but just a quick review. So ruminants have the multi-compartment stomach. So that would be your cows, your sheep and goats, the llamas and alpacas, which are kind of modified ruminants, but still ruminants, and then deer. Hindgut fermenters would be having a simple stomach but a very large intestine and cecum. So that would be horses and rabbits. And then monogastrics would be your simple stomach animals. So that would be pigs. And then also we talked about chickens, even though they have a little bit of a modified system. And then cats and dogs, and then people as well, humans. We have simple stomachs, so we are considered monogastrics. Okay, so moving on to the cardiovascular system. So the cardiovascular system has 3 major elements. So you have animals have 2, a 4-chambered heart, and then blood vessels, and then the actual blood. And so the blood contains plasma, red and white blood cells, and platelets. So we'll talk about each of these a little bit more in detail. So this picture, actually, now that it's blown up, is actually kind of blurry, but this was about the simplest picture I could find to kind of show you this. So the heart has 4 chambers, and so basically you have a right atrium, and then a right ventricle, and then a left atrium and a left ventricle. And so those sides you would kind of think of that like, trying to think. So like if you're like your left arm would be the side that your left atrium would be on, if that makes sense. And so then another way that I kind of keep this straight, as far as the order that they go in, is that, you have the right side and you have the left side. But so atrium, some people will get them confused. So the ventricles are always on the bottom and the atriums are on the top of the heart. And I keep that straight because in the alphabet, A comes before B, V, I don't know why I said B, A comes before V, so the atrium is going to come first, so it's on top of the ventricles. So I don't know if that helps you or not. I just try to give little tidbits about how I remember stuff. So that's kind of how I keep those straight. So the cardiovascular system also is made up of the blood vessels. So we have, and animals have, arteries, veins, and capillaries. So arteries are the blood vessels that take blood away from the heart. So blood is obviously coming into the heart and then it's being pumped out of the heart. So the arteries take blood away from the heart. And again, another way that I keep that straight is arteries away, AA, just a simple way that I keep it straight. And then veins bring blood back to the heart. And then you have capillaries. And so the capillaries bring nutrients, oxygen, and hormones to the cells. They remove waste from the cells, and then they connect the arteries to the veins. So all throughout your body, you have major arteries and veins, and then spreading out from those, you have the capillaries. So now let's talk a little bit more about blood. So blood has different components. So blood plasma is the watery constituent of blood that contains minerals, nutrients, and proteins such as antibodies and clotting proteins. So obviously, blood needs to be able to clot if you get cut or something like that. So those proteins that can do that are contained in the plasma, as well as pretty much most of the proteins and minerals and things like that. So the plasma includes the blood cells and platelets. So the red blood cells and white blood cells, which some of you may have heard of before. So red blood cells are responsible for transporting oxygen and then also carbon dioxide. So when we breathe in, we're breathing in oxygen and then we're expelling CO2 or carbon dioxide. So the red blood cells are kind of responsible for carrying that through the body. So white blood cells are responsible for immune defense. So you may have heard of, like, if you go to the doctor and they say like your white blood cell count is high, that's a good indicator that you have an infection because those white blood cells are responsible for immune defense. And then platelets are responsible for blood clotting. So like I said, blood clotting is really, really important because if you get a cut or anything happens, you really want your blood to clot, otherwise you'll bleed out. So the platelets are responsible for that. So typically, blood outside of a blood vessel will clot rapidly. There are some diseases. I know people that have hemophilia or hemophiliacs. Their blood doesn't clot. So if they get a cut or anything like that, it can be very, very devastating because they will not stop bleeding. So that's kind of just some, disease there, just kind of an exception. But typically in a normal, healthy person, blood outside of a blood vessel will clot rapidly. So if clotted blood is kept for a period of hours in a refrigerator, the clot will retract and kind of settle on the bottom, and a fluid called serum will become separated from the clot. So the difference between blood plasma and blood serum is that the serum doesn't contain the clotting proteins. So the plasma contains the proteins. So again, plasma, proteins, P, and P. I'm all about the letter associations here to keep stuff straight. So this picture just kind of shows you what that would look like. I know typically for my animal trials, we take blood samples and then we separate out the serum, and then the serum is what we use for our analyses. So this would be the clotted blood here at the bottom, and then what you have on top is the serum portion of that. So for respiratory organs, mammals and birds have a trachea that brings air into the lungs and provides an exit for the air. So that is something that mammals and birds have in common. However, they do have a few differences. So in mammals, air is moved in and out of the lungs by contractions of the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles between the ribs. So that's kind of how the process of breathing in takes place in mammals. However, in birds, the air is moved by abdominal as well as other muscles through the lungs and into air sacs. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and just how they differ, because I think this is kind of cool that they have developed this. So the air sacs in birds are blind-ending sacs in the abdominal cavity and the bones, and they're essential for respiration. So, breathing in, taking in oxygen, and then breathing out carbon dioxide. And they actually help to facilitate flight by reducing the weight of the bird. So when all of these sacs can fill with air, that makes the bird really, really light, and it helps them be able to fly. So that's kind of something that's different from mammals. And they have quite a few air sacs. I can't remember exactly how many they have in total, but like in this picture, you can see the front air sacs, and then in the back you have the rear air sacs, and then you might have a few more on the other side as well. So I want to say they could even have as many as 8 possibly. Don't quote me on that number, but it's several, whereas we only have 2 lungs. They have lungs and air sacs, so it's kind of cool. So moving on to muscle, there are 3 types of muscle. So there's skeletal or striated muscle, and that's used for meat. So like if you're eating an animal, then you're eating its skeletal muscle. So the second type is smooth muscle, and that's muscle that's found around the intestines, around the uterus in a female, and then also around the blood vessels to kind of help move the blood and everything along. And the smooth muscle around the intestines is what helps move that ingesta through the system. And then cardiac muscle would be cardiac. So we talked about cardiovascular. So cardiac means around the heart. So cardiac muscle will be the muscle that's around the heart, and that actually contracts rhythmically and spontaneously. So it contracts in a certain rhythm, and it spontaneously contracts. So it doesn't really need to be told to contract to do what it wants to do. So like if you need to move your arm or something like that, a signal from your brain and your nervous system is going to allow you to move your arm. With the heart, it's kind of involuntary. It happens. You don't have to think about okay, well, I need my heart to pump. It just does it. So that's one difference with cardiac muscle there. So muscles are predominantly made of protein, and they're composed of cells or fibers. So a little bit about the structure of muscle. Muscle is composed of multinucleated cells or fibers. So multinucleated just means many nuclei. So it's pretty simple to think about. A lot of the big words, if you kind of just think, look at the word and kind of think about what it means, you can kind of understand. So multinuclei, many nuclei. And then muscle fibers are composed of myofibrils. Myofibrils are composed of a series of sarcomeres, and sarcomeres are composed of contractile elements of a muscle, which are actin and myosin. So that's kind of a lot to take in on one slide. So I think this slide will hopefully kind of help you understand this a little bit better. So here we have, a muscle. So this could be like an arm muscle or leg muscle or what have you. So this muscle is made up of different muscle fibers. So if you see all of these right here, those are all different muscle fibers. So then if you take that muscle fiber, which is right here, and you look at it a little bit closer, you can see that that muscle fiber is made up of myofibrils. And so when you look at a myofibril closer, you can see that they're made up of different sarcomeres all the way along their length. And so then a sarcomere, basically all that means is just kind of the contractile unit of muscle. So sarcomeres contain myosin and actin, which allow muscle to contract. And so like if you have your arm stretched out and you want to bend your arm up, your muscles need to contract to do that. They need to be able to, move that way. And so the sarcomere containing myosin and actin is really what allows muscle to do that. So if you kind of go over this picture, you'll see how you can kind of just break down each part of the muscle, but basically that's the structure. So the skeleton is really important because it functions as the framework for the body, the points of attachment for muscles, and therefore it allows for movement, because if your muscles weren't attached in your body, you wouldn't really be able to move your joints. It also helps protect vital organs. So a good example of that would be the skull. And then also maybe kind of like your ribs and things like that, just keeps everything kind of protected. The skull is really the main one that I think of, or maybe your sternum. And then the skeleton is also a storage place for calcium and phosphorus. So those are two important minerals that are really, really needed for your body. And so the skeleton in your bone is a good place to have those stored, so that if you're not getting an adequate diet, or you're in a malnutrition a state of malnutrition, your body can start kind of breaking down your bone for calcium and phosphorus. So it's an important storage source of those. And so then the two main types of skeletal tissue are cartilage, which is around the joints, and then bone. So next we're going to talk about adipose tissue. So adipose tissue basically means fat tissue. So body fat is essential to the survival of an animal or person. So I know that fat's not always thought of as good or essential or anything like that, but it is essential to survival in certain amounts. So you don't want too much, obviously. So adipose tissue stores energy as what are called triglycerides. And so just a simple picture of kind of what that looks like. There are some more scientific pictures, but for the purpose of this class, this is all you really need to know. So triglycerides are just 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol backbone. So you have monoglycerides, which would be 1 fatty acid, diglycerides would be 2, and then you have triglycerides, which would be 3 fatty acids. So adipose tissue stores energy as that triglyceride form, so 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol. So there are 2 types of adipose tissue. So there's white adipose tissue, which is the tissue that we commonly think of when we think of fat tissue, and that stores energy as triglycerides. And then there is brown adipose tissue, which is way less common. So it's typically found at birth in babies, and then in animals that actually hibernate. We'll have a little bit more brown tissue. So brown adipose tissue is responsible for heat production. So it's important in that aspect. So just so you can kind of see a little bit more what adipose tissue cells look like. So adipocyte is the term for the cells that store energy as fat, or the fat cells. So adipocyte, you can, just a cell that can store fat cells. And these cells make up adipose tissue. So remember in the beginning, we talked about all the cells make up all the organs. So in each organ, the cells that are associated with that organ kind of have their own name. So adipocytes are the cells associated with adipose tissue. So adipo, kind of easy to remember. So as you can see, this adipocyte has all of the components that we talked about, but it has a nucleus up here, and then it kind of has the mitochondria, the Golgi. Everything is kind of up here that it needs. And so most of around in the cytoplasm and everything in the most of the cell space is actually this fat reservoir with the triglycerides, because the fat cells can just kind of get rather huge, and they just store fat as triglycerides. So that's kind of what that looks like. So a little bit more about adipose tissue. If nutrition is inadequate, then triglycerides can be broken down to fatty acids and used for energy, and glycerol can be converted back to glucose. So Fat can be important at times because if for some reason you get stranded somewhere in the desert or I don't know and can't get to food for a couple of days, if that adipose tissue can start being broken down. So you'll need energy. So fatty acids are a good source of energy. And then glycerol can be converted back to glucose. And glucose is an important sugar, and it can be used for many, many processes in the body. And glucose is actually what is used to make ATP that we talked about earlier, which is the energy source of the cell and the energy source of the body. So it's really, really important to be able to have triglycerides there that can be broken down. So adipose tissue can be found in 3 anatomic locations, so just 3 different places. So you have subcutaneous adipose tissue, which is found right under your skin. Then intermuscular and intramuscular. And intramuscular fat is what is known for producing what's called marbling in meat. And so you can see this picture. You can see you kind of have the intramuscular that's kind of around it, and then on the inside of this piece of meat, this steak, you see those white spots. So that's actually intramuscular fat that has been deposited in that meat. And so this is important because it improves eating qualities. It improves the tenderness, the taste, and things like that. So typically when meat is being graded as, prime or choice or whatever, whatever it's going to be graded as, one of the characteristics that will be looked at is this marbling quality. So how much intramuscular fat does it have? So that's actually a really, really good thing and something that is thought a lot about when it comes to beef cattle nutrition. So in addition to subcutaneous and intramuscular fat, you can also have abdominal fat, which would be around the intestines and the kidneys. And that's primarily to also protect the intestines and the kidneys from any sort of damage or anything like that. That fat is kind of a good cushion there. So that's kind of why some people will gain weight, in that area because it's hard to get rid of. And that's actually, you don't want too much of it, but some of it can actually be pretty helpful to keep your organs safe. So then next we have the nervous system. So the nervous system consists of the brain, spinal cord, sensory organs, and nerves that connect all of the organs with the rest of the body, or connect like all of these organs with the rest of the body. So like I was saying, if you want to move your arm and you need a signal from your brain, how is that signal going to be transmitted to your arm to tell it to move? And that's through the nervous system. So the nervous system is what would cause that muscle to contract. The parts of the muscle would cause it to contract, but that is really what would do it, is the nervous system has to send that signal. So the nervous system is responsible mainly, the 2 main functions of the nervous system are control and communication. So the 2 C's. So they control things that are going on in the body, and then they communicate with other organs. So the neurons are what we call the nerve cells. So remember I said that the cells make up the different organs, and every kind of organ system has its own term for the cells in that system. So the neurons are what we call nerve cells. So N and N, pretty easy to keep straight. So the neurons are nerve cells that communicate with the body by transmitting electrochemical signals. And so they're the basic building blocks of the nervous system. So just to kind of show you what a neuron looks like, because they are a different looking cell than some of the other cells that we've seen. So they have this cell body here, and then they have what are called dendrites. So they kind of almost look like little trees. They kind of come off of the cell body. And so the dendrites are what can actually receive a signal from another neuron, because it'll just be kind of transmitted all the way through the body. And then once this neuron receives the signal, it will send it all the way down the axon, which is this long part, to the terminal bulb. And so then here you would almost have another neuron waiting right here, that terminal bulb would then send the signal on, and so forth and so on. So that's how that works. So the nervous system and the brain, the nervous system can be broken into three functionally distinct systems. So you have the central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord, the peripheral nervous system, which is basically the nerves that are outside of the brain and spinal cord, so there are nerves all through your body, and then the autonomic nervous system. And so the autonomic nervous system is really important because that is responsible for the functions that require little conscious control. So your reflex responses, breathing, because you don't consciously think to breathe, you just do it. Gut function, again, you're not thinking about moving things through your gut. That needs to happen kind of involuntary. Temperature control, feeding control, and reproduction. So the nervous system and the brain are essential for many life processes. They're responsible for the control of movement. Like I said, if you need to, move your arm or your leg, that's going to happen through signals from the nervous system. And then the nervous system is also responsible for what is called homeostasis. So this is a term that some of you may remember from high school biology. But so to kind of refresh your memory, homeostasis just means maintaining constant conditions in the body, whether it's temperature or pH, or any sort of balance in the body that needs to be maintained is called homeostasis. So there are so many processes that go on in the body on a daily basis that work in opposition to each other to make sure that there is a good balance or homeostasis. And so the nervous system also has vital roles in reproduction and growth. So a little bit about endocrine organs. So endocrine glands, that's supposed to say glands, not glads, or tissues produce hormones. So remember earlier we talked about how the cell membrane has receptors for hormones, and that's how cells can communicate with the rest of the body. A hormone will bind and tell that cell what it needs to do. So hormones are produced by endocrine organs. So hormones are basically just chemical messengers, and they're messengers that work closely with the autonomic nervous system to maintain homeostasis because they need to maintain balance. So cells need to know what they need to do to be able to maintain that balance and control key functions such as metabolism, growth, reproduction, and lactation. So hormones are really responsible for a lot that goes on in the body. So where are hormones produced? Where are these endocrine tissues that in the body that produce these hormones? So there are a lot of different endocrine tissues in the body. So you have the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which are going to be in the brain. You have your thyroid glands, adrenal glands, islets of Langerhans, and those are in the pancreas. So the pancreas is a big endocrine organ. Gonads, the gut, liver, adipose tissue, and the pineal gland, which is also in the brain. So those are some of the major endocrine tissues that will produce hormones to help maintain homeostasis and other physiological processes. So some of the major ones that we're going to talk about, a few of the major metabolic hormones. So gut hormones and metabolic hormones are involved in the control of digestion, changes in motility, and secretion in the gastrointestinal tract. So gut hormones may be involved in appetite control, as well as affecting secretion of the two major metabolic hormones, which are insulin and glucagon. So these are the two that we're going to kind of briefly talk about. For intro, you don't really need to know the exact specifics of these, but just kind of have a general idea of what they do. So like what I said, the pancreas is an endocrine organ. It does secrete hormones. So the pancreas actually secretes both of the major metabolic hormones, insulin and glucagon. They're secreted by different cell types in the pancreas, but they're both from the pancreas. So insulin helps maintain blood sugar as well as glucagon. So they both help maintain glucose levels. But remember, we need to maintain homeostasis. So you don't want too much glucose in the blood and you don't want too little. So how does this happen? So insulin actually affects glucose utilization and storage. So insulin is typically secreted in what we call the fed state. So that would be as you're eating a meal, right after you ate a meal, you've been fed. And so insulin will actually cause glucose to be used for the production of ATP, and then it will be causing glucose to be stored because you just got fed, you have excess glucose, you don't really need all of it in the blood, so it will store it for later use. So insulin will increase glycogen, and so glycogen is just the storage form of glucose. That's what that means. So that's how insulin helps maintain glucose. So insulin will typically be secreted when there's high glucose in the body. And then glucagon, like I said, you want to maintain homeostasis. So glucagon works in opposition to the function of insulin. So glucagon also maintains glucose levels, but it is typically secreted in the fasting state. So like if you didn't eat for, several hours or a day, glucagon would be secreted because your body needs glucose. It needs energy. It needs to make ATP. So glucagon would be secreted in the fasting state. And glucagon would then signal the breakdown of that storage form of glucose, so the glycogen, and that would result in increased glucose levels in your blood. So those are just the two main metabolic hormones that maintain those levels. And so there are a lot of hormones that work in opposition to each other because everything is about maintaining a proper balance. So just a little bit about the major gut hormones. You have gastrin, which stimulates the release of gastric acid in the stomach of monogastrics. So we talked about how hydrochloric acid and gastric acid are produced to start digestion. CCK, which is cholecystokinin, but you just need to know it as CCK for this class. I'm not going to ask you to remember the term. That stimulates the release of bile from the gallbladder and the release of pancreatic enzymes. Ghrelin stimulates appetite. Secretin stimulates the release of a bicarbonate buffer. So when the acid in the stomach is produced and starts breaking down the feed, you don't really want that acidic environment to continue through the rest of the gastrointestinal tract because the cells in the tract are not equipped to handle the acidic conditions. So you need a buffer added to kind of bring up that pH to more of a basic state. So secretin is responsible for that. Peptide YY reduces gut motility and induces satiety. So satiety basically just means that you feel full, you're no longer hungry. And then somatostatin inhibits the release of gastric acid and other hormones. So gastrin and somatostatin would kind of work in opposition like insulin and glucagon. So just some hormones to kind of be familiar with and what they do and how they work to maintain balance in the body. So a little bit about the integration of organs and body functioning. So body function is controlled by nerves, the nervous system, including central nervous system and brain, like we talked about, and then also hormones that are produced by the endocrine glands. So some ways that these organs can be integrated to work together would be in the control of food intake for nutrient or calorie benefit, the control of metabolism with the hormones glucagon and insulin, like we talked about. So different organ systems can work together is basically what I want you to understand from that. And then lastly, we're just going to talk quickly about pheromones. So pheromones are kind of similar to hormones, but not quite. So they're specific chemicals or mixtures, and they're produced by one animal in order to produce an effect on another animal of the same species. So for example, cats have feline facial pheromone, which is used to mark their territory. And then they also have a pheromone that they can spray, which you don't typically want to do that because they mark that by going to the bathroom. And that can smell really, really awful. Dogs have pheromones that are used as a sexual attractant and arousal pheromone, and then dog appeasing pheromone. Pigs have what's called boar taint steroid, so that's why typically boars are castrated and turned into barrows because boar taint can really affect meat quality and it smells really, really bad. They also have a maternal pheromone, and then sheep and goats have the pheromone effect on reproduction. So that is all I have for today. I hope you all have a good rest of the day, and I will see you on Tuesday.